from Los Angeles. I, as most of you know, work at the Pacific Council on International Policy. I am delighted to welcome you to our conversation with Dr. Ashley Tellis, who is the Tata Chair for Strategic Affairs and a Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I'm going to call him Ashley because we're buddies, but so forgive me. He really is Dr. Tellis. He went to the University of Chicago, where he got his PhD. He worked with the leading, really almost the founder of American Indian studies of India in the United States, Professors Lloyd and Suzanne Rudolph. And Dr. Tellis, Ashley and I worked at RAND for a number of years. I've actually followed in his wake on trips to India, which were always incredibly illuminating. And he really is you know, our country's leading expert on South Asia. He works on international security issues, U.S. foreign and defense policy issues, not exclusively India and the subcontinent, but also as it relates to China. He's also served in the United States Department of State as senior advisor to the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. When Robert Blackwell was named ambassador to India, what Bob Blackwell did, which strikes me to this day as genius, as he persuaded, and it was not easy, Dr. Tellis to go with him to New Delhi to be his senior advisor. And it's complicated being an ambassador. India has unique complications, and these are not difficulties. It's a very, very large and complex country. It's not something you learn quickly. As you all know, our former mayor, Eric Garcetti, is, as we speak, jetting to New Delhi. I hope he finds himself a Dr. Ashley Tellis to advise him, because this is not a job for the faint of heart. Ashley also served on the National Security Council as Special Assistant to President Bush, George W. Bush, and the Senior Director for Strategic Planning on Southwest Asia. And as I mentioned earlier, he and I served together at RAND, and he was also a professor at the Pardee, I guess it was then the RAND Graduate School, which is now the Pardee School. So Ashley, welcome to the Pacific Council. I know you're in Dallas. I wish you had kept going and we could do this in person here. We're really very, very pleased to see you, and thank you for taking time to talk to us.
Well, I'm delighted to be here with you, Jerry, partly because of our old association, but also because I know of the work of the Pacific Council. And of course, the subject that we're going to talk about today is one that I've been deeply involved in now for almost 3 decades. So really delighted to be here with you.
Well, thank you. Let me begin, and I want to alert our audience that we will be opening the floor in due course to your questions, which Val will direct to me, and I'll direct them to Dr. Tellis. But Ashley, let me start with a kind of, you know, sort of a simple-minded question, but one that I have long pondered. When I was at RAND, I was in India quite a lot, actually. And I met Narendra Modi when he was Chief Minister of Gujarat. And he has a reputation for basically pogroms that happened in Gujarat against Muslim Indians, who are a significant part of the population of India. And as a Middle East specialist who studies Islam and Muslims, I walked in with the attitude that I was going to set him straight, and I was going to let him know what I think, and I was going to ask hard questions. And to my chagrin, many years later, I failed across the board. I was utterly captivated by him. I was charmed by him. I understood what charisma really means. And I walked out, I think I was probably eating out of his hand, despite the fact that the historical record seems to be pretty clear. So my question for you is Modi the person? Modi, he's never married. He's a Hindu national. I mean, he's a very interesting, complex person. And anything you can tell us about him, I think would be very, very illuminating as a means to understand India today.
So several things, Jerry, and I think the word you used, the adjective you used, charismatic, is probably the best way to describe him. I mean, when you look at the pantheon of Indian politicians who dominate the national scene today, he really stands out because he has an ability to relate to people um, in a way that belies his reputation.
Right.
He is extremely disarming. He can be extremely genial. And he speaks in a language that, on one hand, can be extremely funny. I mean, he can be extremely humorous in the way that he relates to you and speaks to you, but also touches you because he is not part of the elites. He does not use, highfalutin language. He speaks in the language that his interlocutors can understand. And he leaves you with a very strong sense about his passion to transform India. Now, the vision that he brings to the job, of course, is a controversial vision. And, there are debates going on within India as we speak about what kind of India will he leave behind. But I don't think anyone challenges the proposition that he deeply cares about his country and, is driven to transform it. He wants India to be genuinely a great power. He wants India to be genuinely a partner of the United States. And he also wants India to be a new voice of the global South. And some of those ambitions are in tension with one another. And we shall see, how the next few years demonstrate his ability to sort of navigate, these competing tensions. But he has certainly changed the Indian political landscape in ways that people did not expect when he was elected for the first time in 2014. And I believe that just given his personal drive, his personal ambition, his nationalist, ambitions for the country, that we have not seen the end of this transformation. There is a national election which is a year or so out. He is likely to get a third term on current predictions, and that will give him enormous leverage with respect to institutionalizing the changes he wants to leave behind. So, we keep our fingers crossed and hope they are all to the good. But there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that when the history of this country is written, many decades out, he will stand out there with Jawaharlal Nehru and Indira Gandhi as being one of the three pivotal personalities in India's history. And I would, of course, add to that his own predecessor, Manmohan Singh, because of the economic reforms that Manmohan Singh brought about and so on and so forth. But in terms of sheer scale of transformation, I think he will be one of the 3 or 4 people on the Indian pantheon when this history is recorded.
That's a remarkably, powerful and profound insight. Because the 3 people, the 2 people predecessors you mentioned were, basically, the founders of modern India as we know it. And it strikes me that he is incredibly ambitious, as you say. He loves his country, but his vision of country sort of differs somewhat from his predecessors, and is for him to accomplish what he needs dependent on his being sort of this rather extreme Hindi nationalist. In other words, one of the things that's so distinctive about India and really remarkable, even compared to the United States. I remember, you won't remember this, you and I visited a naval ship at one of our visits to India. And I was asking somebody about the chaplains. I said, how do you have chaplains in the military? You have so many different religions. And I was told, we don't have chaplains. We are not in the religion business. And I thought about it and I thought, this is actually something very, very good. It's not the state's responsibility. They really, so, the sort of favoring one population over others. I don't, why does he have to do that? Why could he not achieve what he wants to achieve and relying on the sort of distinct, characteristics of India, which in many ways were ahead of the United States?
So I think this is, again, part of a transition that India is going through that has deep roots, actually predate, India's independence in 1947. When India became independent, it became independent, Jerry, as you know all too well, amidst the carnage of partition. And partly because India was reacting to the carnage of partition, and partly because its founding fathers, primarily Mahatma Gandhi and Pandit Nehru, were so eager to make India a homeland for all the diverse nationalities that populated its soil. The solution that was settled on was to build essentially a secular democratic republic. Democratic republic because they wanted people to exercise their right to choose their own government. That's what the freedom movement was about. But they also wanted it to be secular because they were conscious of the fact that although India was a Hindu majority state demographically, there was a very large Muslim population that did not migrate to Pakistan. And they wanted to prove in many ways, ideationally, that there was no need for Pakistan, that the idea of India was large and capacious enough that it could accommodate adherents of all faiths. And the fact that you are a full citizen of India did not require you to be Hindu in order to enjoy that citizenship. Mm-hmm. And so the idea of creating a secular republic was meant to signal that irrespective of your religious commitments, citizenship was essentially something that came to you purely out of constitutional commitments to the Constitution, a commitment to, in a sense, the soil rather than commitment to blood, right, in the traditional categorization. Now, there was another point of view that lost out in this debate at the time of independence. And that point of view was that India ought to be a self-consciously Hindu state, just as Pakistan became a self-consciously Muslim state. And those who held this point of view belonged to a political party called the Jansa. Now, the current BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, of which Modi is a part of, is really the political successors to the old Jansa. And so he represented, or he represents, essentially this alternative point of view that lost out at the time of India's founding. Today, this party is now preeminent in Indian politics. And it is pursuing essentially an intellectual or an ideational or an ideological, depending on how you want to characterize it, agenda, which says that it is now time for India's polity to reflect more clearly the demographic facts on the ground. And that India does not need to be secular in the way that Jawaharlal Nehru and the early generation of India's founders imagined, because they believe that Hinduism is innately liberal, and therefore creating a consciously or a self-consciously Hindu state does not of necessity pose any threat to India's minorities. Now, India's minorities, of course, may differ with that conceptualization. And many Hindus themselves would differ with that conceptualization. But the fact of the matter is, Modi's BJP believes that it is time for India to right historical wrongs And what are those historical wrongs? They believe that India has always been a great civilization and that its greatest moments were when it was self-consciously Hindu. And that civilization was marred, was brutalized, essentially by the Muslim invasions, which began about 1,000 years ago, 1,200 years ago to be precise, followed by the era of Western colonialism. And they believe that these two interruptions in India's history, first the advent of Islam in the subcontinent, followed by Western colonialism, essentially destroyed the integrity of India's Hindu civilization. And it is this worldview that they are now trying to reconstruct. So there is a political agenda, which is to transform the Indian state and its secular character into something that is more self-consciously Hindu. But there is also an ideational agenda, which is to erase what they see are the blemishes in India's history. And that's really what his political project is about. Now, he is, for all that is said and done, also an utterly pragmatic politician. So he is going to, I believe, push what is called the Hindutva agenda, which is making India more self-consciously Hindu, both in its polity and in its politics. He is going to push that to the limits that Indian politics will tolerate. And he is trying to normalize it, through essentially peaceful constitutional means. But, whether these constitutional means are always licit is actually the big debate in India today. And whether this process of making India self-consciously Hindu will invoke pushback, particularly on the still significant, secular constituencies in India, and more importantly, India's minorities, also remains to be seen. So this is, as a social scientist, this is a fascinating experiment in large-scale social transformation in a state that we had previously thought had settled all the fundamental questions of its political personality. We would look at India with some admiration, precisely because it was so diverse, so poor, so differentiated internally, and yet remained both democratic and secular. And today the question really is the experience of the last 60 or 70 years going to be just exceptional in India's history, with India now reverting to the mean, where its politics basically reflects its demography, where there's nothing remarkable about India as this secular experiment? Or will it be able to maintain, not just in the letter, but also in the spirit, the idea of India that was incarnated, in the 1950 Constitution that the Indians gave themselves? And I think the next few years will tell us whether the 1950 Constitution, which created a secular democratic republic, can survive in the face of what is very clearly a self-consciously revisionist agenda on the part of this party.
Well, and the other thing, not to be too social sciencey, because we'll move on, but what you're talking about is reminiscent of developments in Mexico, the United States, Israel, Turkey, a number of this revisionism and somehow, correcting, the mistakes made between, the founding and today, revisiting, relitigating things that we thought were settled is happening around the world, which is interesting and not, I don't want to dwell on it too much, but it's really, it's really.
Look,
really,
you raise a really important point, Jerry, that what is happening in India is not unique in that sense. There is part of a larger wave of transformation that is taking place in global politics,
That's exactly
whose
right.
end result we have not quite seen yet, although we can sort of imagine the contours of what that might be. And we don't understand the implications of what that means, because as more and more of these states begin to define themselves civilizationally, rather than in terms of, the abstract constitutions that they created for themselves early on, there will be consequences both in terms of domestic and international politics. And I don't think we fully understand those yet.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. Let me move on to more, day-to-day considerations. One is, as someone with expertise on both India and China, which you have, creating, in a sense, amalgamating the Pacific region and the Indian Ocean, so the strategic construct of Indo-Pacific, the creation of the Quad, which is an alliance or an agreement amongst Japan, India, the United States, and Australia. Can you unpack that for us a little bit? Explain what it, where it came from, what it means, and assess its potential power.
Absolutely. And that takes us to, in a sense, foundational questions about the architecture of Asian politics as it stands, right? So since the end of the Cold War, we came face to face with a reality that could have been foreseen, but was not easily digested. And that was, we were literally historical witnesses to the rise of a new great power, and that is China. And the United States, in many ways, midwifed the rise of Chinese power through decisions that were made ever since President Nixon visited China in 1972. But after the Cold War, the rise of Chinese power basically, gathered steam, and it became one of the defining features of essentially the Asian political system. China eclipsed Japan, which was, the previous great power in the continent. Russia lost capabilities very dramatically. And so the question began to be asked about what would be the relationship of this new rising power, China, with the existing great power, the United States. Now, sort of lost or eclipsed in the shuffle was another reality, that there was a second rising power, and that was India. It grew more slowly than China. It started its reforms a good decade after China did. And it did not demonstrate, the breathtaking pace of growth that China demonstrated, for a good 3 decades. But India was rising all the same. And so from a US point of view, as the relationship with China began to take on the sort of aura of competitiveness, Washington naturally gravitated to looking for partners that it could corral or rope in to creating some sort of a balance to this new rising power. And particularly after the Taiwan crisis began to take center stage in US-China relations, the imperatives of finding new partners to balance China only increased. And India became a natural in that search, because as it turned out, India and China also had rivalries of their own, independent of the rivalry between China and the United States. And so if you remember the old Indian adage, going back to Kautilya, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? It put us in a position where the US and India clearly began to discover a common interest in limiting Chinese assertiveness. And before you know it, the US and India began to define a new relationship, which very much had China in its peripheral vision. Now, I was in Delhi, as you pointed out, with Bob Blackwell during the first term of the Bush administration. And it had become clear to New Delhi even then that they were going to be facing this new behemoth on their northern borders, and that they would need external assistance in coping with this new superpower on their doorstep. And I think that awareness was slowly becoming apparent in Washington as well, though because of the events of 9/11, China somehow got eclipsed in our strategic calculations because, the war on terrorism essentially took the wind out of our strategic efforts for 20 years. But once the war against terrorism, in a sense, had run its course, we went back to, in a sense, the old challenge, which was new rising powers that potentially threaten American allies, Taiwan, Japan, Australia, the Philippines, and so on and so forth. And in that context, the US and India began to lay the foundations for this new relationship. Now, in recent years, it's taken on a very particular manifestation, and that is the manifestation of the Quad, where the 4 countries that are most directly affected by the rise of Chinese power, the United States, Japan, Australia, and India, have finally decided to form a partnership to balance China. Now, nobody's going to fess up to that.
Right.
Least of all India,
Right.
because India is very conscious of the fact that it is weaker than China. It's conscious of the fact that it lives next door to China. And it wants to avoid, above all else, a manifest enmity with China, because India is still not in a position to cope with a truly pugnacious China on its own. So what it's doing is it's walking a tightrope. It's trying to build up its own national capabilities in order to meet the challenge of China, while also seeking refuge in a larger coalition that will help to limit China's capacity to harm India's interests. But even as it does so, it's bending backwards to make the argument that this is not a new Asian NATO directed as China. Because what it wants is enough reassurance to deter the Chinese from doing something crazy against Indian interests, but not alarm the Chinese into adopting punitive strategies towards India, because India has suddenly become part of some military balancing coalition. And that's the tightrope walk that New Delhi is trying to pursue. Now, it's important to make one other point. The United States, Japan, and Australia, the other 3 partners in the Quad, are already tied to each other by a very tight alliance network. And their conception of what balancing China involves is a little more hard-edged than the Quad's conception of balancing China. And that is something that we must recognize. And India, in that sense, is the squeaky wheel. India is not going to let the Quad become a balancing coalition because it wants freedom of action. It wants to maintain a relationship with China, irrespective of what happens in the context of US-China relations. And it is not in a position where it can engage in an all-out military competition with China, which it is desperately seeking to avoid. So there are nuances to the Indian participation in the Quad that I think need to be appreciated by all our listeners. Because, in the US, we tend to think of alliances as the default mechanism for dealing with challenges. And India doesn't want to be part of that alliance system in the traditional sense.
And one other instrument that I think India is using, and I'd love your view on this to sort of, balance things out, is its relationship with Russia. So if you could talk a little bit about, India, Russia, Ukraine, because their positions there are not,
Absolutely,
with their Quad partners, and I think, for obvious and understandable reasons.
Absolutely. And this is something, again, that is often misunderstood or glossed over in the US. So India definitely has China as its principal challenge. And to deal with China as its principal challenge, of course, it has bet heavily now on the United States and its extension, which is the Quad. but it cannot put all its money, as it were, on one basket. It wants to maintain a diversified set of relations in order to deal with China. And the other prong, or at least one of the other prongs, is its old relationship with Russia, going back to the days when Russia was once the Soviet Union. And why does it, attempt to protect that relationship? And we saw this most clearly in the war in Ukraine, where for all of the U.S. India partnership's benefits to Delhi, India has refrained from condemning the Russians in a way that we would have liked them to. They've never voted against Russia in any UN forum. They've been very careful in how they've characterized Russia's part in the Ukraine conflict, and so on and so forth. So why? Most people tend to think that this is because India has a great dependence on Russia for military equipment. And I think that is true. But I think that misses very important parts of the picture that go beyond just a military relationship. So what is that? The first is that the Indians want to do their damnedest to prevent the Russians from coming closer to China than they have to, because it is in India's interest that Moscow maintains some distance from Beijing. Right. And the Indians have drawn the conclusion that if they join the Western coalition against Russia, the Russians will have no choice but to end up even more deeply in bed with Beijing. Mm-hmm. And that does not serve India's interests. Mm-hmm. They want to maintain Russia as a partner with some fidelity in their competition with China. But there is a second and even more important reason that we do not pay attention to. And it's this. India wants to make certain that China does not dominate Asia. That's very clear. So the Indians want a multipolar Asia, just as the United States wants a multipolar Asia. On that, we are both agreed. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to the global level, the ambitions are radically different. That's right. The United States wants to maintain essentially hegemonic power in the global system. It wants to be the primary entity in global politics. The Indians are content to live with American primacy at the moment because they cannot alter the reality of that primacy. But they do not believe that a perpetually unipolar global system is one that serves their long-term interests. Rather, they see multipolarity at the global level to be just as important as institutionalizing multipolarity at the Asian level. And you cannot get multipolarity at the global level unless you get Russia as one of the poles. That's right. And so the Indians are very intent on preventing anything that might result in the demise of Russia as a potential pole in the long-term global order. And that's the reason why they're deeply uncomfortable with US sanctions on Russia, why they're deeply uncomfortable with the US effort to strangulate Russia because of the invasion of Ukraine, and so on and so forth. And so there are fundamental questions of global order on which India has a very different view in comparison to the United States. Right. And we tend to neglect that fact because we are so focused on China that we think that India's partnership with us with respect to China equals a partnership with us on all questions of global order. And that, to my mind, is a fundamental misreading of India's calculations and its ambitions in international politics.
Well, plus the United States is seeking unipolarity on the cheap. In other words, it depends who you talk to. The Trump people, obviously, America first is a very different view and a very popular one in certain circles. And the United States would like, we don't want the heavy lifting of the work of the responsibility, but we wouldn't mind if it happened. I mean, in my world, in the Middle East, the remarkable peace negotiations or reconciliation negotiations between Iran and Saudi Arabia, negotiated in Beijing in Chinese, is just startling. It's startling. And so, you know, the world is a very, very different place. And the United States is a very different place. And that if you're, you know, New Delhi or Beijing or whatever, you need to, you know, you need to sort of prepare for all contingencies, and, you know, a MAGA United States or a more traditional, you know, Biden-esque United States, and you don't know what you're going to get. Let me ask you another question, if I may. Ambassador Garcetti, I don't know where Eric is. He's either there or on a plane or, you know, busy packing up. What talking points is the State Department likely to give him? You know, when they give him his mission, his assignment, you know, what are the issues that are at the top of their list? And how does that differ or align with what he's going to hear from his Indian interlocutors when he gets to Delhi?
Well, I don't know what the State Department is
No,
always
no.
tell him, but
No.
I think, you know, the obvious things that would be worth emphasizing are first that the United States cares about the partnership with India and that it will continue to invest in that partnership. However, we need to understand both sides, what the direction and the limits of that partnership are. Because in my mind, there is a temptation for us to mislead each other simply on the basis of our rhetoric. That our rhetoric is so lofty and soaring that we could end up believing things that are simply not true. And the biggest dangers here are actually in Washington, not in New Delhi. Because India is the weaker of the two partners. So the Indians are deadly cautious about, you know, taking seriously what they mean when they say to us. Whereas because we have such a surfeit of power, we tend not to listen too closely to what India means when it says the things it does. And so I think part of, you know, Ambassador Garcetti's task will be to help our own policymakers here understand where exactly India is coming from and educate them in ways that might limit the capacity for, you know, romanticism, which often afflicts, you know, our newly found friendships. Denny Blair, you know, our Indo-PACOM commander when I was in Delhi, and then later the director of national intelligence, once had a wonderful line. He said, you know, we are Americans. If there's anything worth doing, it's worth overdoing. And, you know, the relationship with India can sometimes, you know, be a good example of what that means in practice. And so I think Ambassador Garcetti will have a huge task, you know, sort of educating us here back, you know, in the United States about the kind of country that he is accredited to. So that's task number one. Task number two will be to push those elements where we've made progress, but in my view, there is a huge opportunity yet to be exploited. And that is everything from defense to economics, where the gains have been impressive compared to, you know, the achievements of 20 years ago when Bob and I were in Delhi. But we still have a long ways to go. And I see this as being a very important task for the ambassador. And I would flag here particularly progress on the economic front, because the Indian economy is still far too closed for American comfort. The opportunities in the realm of trade, in the realm of business, are still far too limited, given India's size and given India's ambitions. The market access that American companies enjoy is still quite constrained. And so there is a long list of unfinished business, you know, that the ambassador will have to find ways of managing. The third area is the area that we actually started talking about, at the beginning of this conversation, which is how do we manage what we see as India's democratic, disfigurement, and prevent that from undermining the progress made in the bilateral relationship. And this has been a perennial problem for the United States with all its friends, right? We have a comparable problem with respect to Turkey, for example. How do you deal with a country that is a valued partner and yet is moving in directions domestically that leave Americans somewhat queasy? And this is a task, particularly in a democracy like India, which has to be handled with utmost delicacy. Because U.S. India relations are a relatively new phenomenon. The baggage of suspicion about the United States is still very strong in Indian politics. And so, we don't want to sort of raise problems that can be better managed if we do it with greater sort of subtlety and sophistication. So I think this is going to tax him, this issue, more than any other, considerably. So he'll have his hands full. And, we obviously wish him well because we both know him and we know at what an important time in the relationship he's heading to Delhi.
The day after he was nominated for the position, and this was, 2 years ago or over 2 years ago, I sent him a congratulatory note and I encouraged him to call you. And I don't know if he did, but I sort of described the role you played with Bob Blackwell. And so you're right.
No, we've been in touch. We've been in
Good.
touch. And
Good.
I am just delighted because he is jumping in with both feet into the job.
Yep.
And he really wants to make a success of it, which I think is absolutely fantastic.
I could not agree more. How would you characterize the state of Pakistani Indian relations, which actually it's a story that you don't hear, but it's changed and evolved quite a bit, but nobody talks about it in a way that I think they should because it's actually interesting.
You will remember the days, Jerry, when we were at RAND, when, many US government agencies were still funding us to look at, the potential for India-Pakistan crises and war, and, in the more dramatic taskings we got to even evaluate the prospects for nuclear war and so on and so forth. And so it's striking that now India-Pakistan relations just don't feature, right? And I think that's because two transformations have taken place. One is that India is now increasingly seen as, China's peer, not Pakistan's peer. And that is in some ways a welcome shift because I think that is the true measure of where the two countries are. But the second transformation has been Pakistan's gradual descent into ungovernability. And it always had the potential for that, but it was bailed out, almost every other decade because of some crisis that brought the United States into Pakistani politics. And the United States ended up providing sort of emergency injections of political support and financial support. Now, ever since we've pulled out of Afghanistan, our interest in Pakistan has just radically diminished, to a point where it's virtually non-existent. I mean, obviously, we want Pakistan not to collapse. We want Pakistan to still remain stable. But the kind of attention Pakistan enjoyed since the 9/11 attacks, that is simply, now in the rearview mirror. Now, the tragedy in Pakistan is that the fundamental problems of the state, first, the hybrid character of the regime, which is it is both a civilian government and a military government simultaneously. That balance has still not resolved. Two, the character of state-society relations, the character of the Pakistani state in relationship to its own society is still very deeply unsettled. And we are beginning to see this every day, in the problems involving Imran Khan, the military, and other political parties in Pakistan. Three, the Pakistani economy is in very deep crisis. And it has reached a stage where none of its traditional friends, the United States, China, or Saudi Arabia, are willing to bail it out because no one feels compelled to do so anymore. And unless, those economic conditions are ameliorated or rectified, the state could be in even deeper troubles in time to come. So it is really unfortunate that we think of Pakistan as a basket case that doesn't deserve our attention, and we're pretty much content to let it sort of, proceed on its own trajectory. Now, in India-Pakistan relations, so the situation we have right now is that of a cold peace. India has cut off essentially diplomatic representation in Pakistan because of the problems of terrorism emanating from Pakistani soil, often with the support of the Pakistan military. The Modi government has taken the view that there will be no normalcy in the relationship if Pakistan does not control terrorism. And it's very clear that Pakistan either cannot or will not control terrorism, at least for the foreseeable future, which means that the Indians have no incentives to go back to something that resembles a normal relationship with Pakistan. Because Pakistan's circumstances are so powerless at this point in time, they've also decided that, they can't make too many efforts at re-engaging India because they have no chips to put on the table.
That's right.
And so both sides have essentially, reached the conclusion that they're going to settle for this cold peace, where as long as the equilibrium is not disturbed, we will basically have a relationship between the two sides that is a non-relationship, at least where diplomacy is concerned. And I do not see that changing anytime soon, because the Modi government does not see any political payoffs from re-engaging Pakistan because it was rebuffed after the early initiatives that Prime Minister Modi took with Nawaz Sharif. And the Pakistan civilian government, I think, has enough troubles of its own domestically, that as long as India does not engage in any saber rattling vis-a-vis Islamabad, they don't feel that they have enough capital to deploy in terms of improving relations with India. So we are left in this low-level equilibrium trap, as it were, that I think is going to define bilateral relations, at least until the elections that are going to come about both in Pakistan and India in the next couple of years.
And the other, factor that makes this even, more threatening is this is a failed state, or, you called it ungovernable. An ungovernable state that I kind of think of as a failed state with a considerable nuclear arsenal. And, this is something that is of concern to the planet. It's not simply of concern to India. It should be of concern to all of us.
Absolutely. But I would just make one point on that,
Sure.
Jerry. The Pakistanis have made remarkable investments in protecting their nuclear weapons since the days of 9/11.
Mm-hmm.
And it has been largely because of the embarrassment created by A.Q. Khan,
Mm-hmm.
and because the United States, starting in the days of the Bush administration, leaned on Pakistan very heavily and provided a good deal of assistance, actually, to help them, safeguard their arsenal, at least where its security is concerned. And and that's a collective good, right? I mean, to the degree that Pakistan's nuclear arsenal is safe, not only is Pakistan safe, but the rest of the world is safe as well, or at least safe.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. We have a question from Nasim Kader, which I mentioned earlier, but his is much more specifically articulated, and he's asking you to talk about the treatment of the 200 million Muslims in India under the BJP government that he says has moved further to the right. So if you would, share your views with that on all of us, that would be great.
So it's a complicated problem to describe, because clearly the BJP government is a government that does not look at Muslims in the way that its predecessors did.
Mhm.
There is a suspicion about Muslims, and that suspicion is linked to their reading of Indian history, that they see the Muslim past or India's Muslim past as essentially an aberration in what was otherwise a golden age. And they are suspicious that Indian Muslims are not exactly, full citizens of the Republic in a way that Hindus are. But this government has been very careful not to engage in any state-sponsored persecution of Muslims, because they understand the risks of doing so. And Prime Minister Modi, who's an utterly pragmatic politician, recognizes that he does not want to incur additional blemishes, particularly in terms of his national and international standing. And so he has been, in many ways, actually the moderate face of the broader BJP party on this question. But the danger is this, that because the attitudes to Muslims has shifted very perceptibly in India from the very top, there have been many social groups that are affiliated with the BJP and particularly part of the larger, Sangh Parivar movement, the RSS and its affiliates, that have often taken matters into their own hands and engaged in what you could think of as micro-level persecutions of Muslims. Everything from, every now and then lynching of Muslim citizens, attacking Muslims for the trades that they engage in, and so on and so forth. And very often the government of India has not been responsive enough to protecting the security of individuals who have been so targeted. So there has clearly been a rise in societal level discrimination and sometimes violence against Muslims, with the state being less than responsive to protecting the rights of Muslim citizens. And that is something that, the United States has on many occasions privately complained. The State Department's annual reporting about religious freedom and human rights protection has persistently flagged. And, we have, to the degree that we can, had this conversation with India, and I expect that conversation is not going to stop.
The Pacific Council has a wonderful tradition. When one of our members is appointed as ambassador, which happens with some regularity, we send a delegation, an inspection tour, actually a delegation to that country, to not only meet with the ambassador, but to educate people in Los Angeles about particular countries. And we're sending a delegation to Norway and Finland. The timing couldn't be better because the ambassador to Norway is from Los Angeles and the ambassador to Finland is from Northern California. So we will most certainly send a delegation to India while our member and friend Ambassador Garcetti is there. It's something that I think it's important for you're a former Californian, for Californians to understand that they too need a seat at the table. So
Absolutely.
my final question, and since you're in Dallas, I asked you about this before everybody came on, and Modi visited Texas, and was it Howdy Modi? I think the event was called, or something like that.
Yes.
But given that our vice president is Indian, half Indian American at least, given there's an incredible prominence of Indian Americans in every sphere of American life, how would you characterize sort of Indian American? I know it's hard because of the incredible diversity, but are Indian Americans constituted as some sort of group or groups that have an impact on U.S. Indian policy, or is it a more emotional type of attachment to India?
I think It's a complicated question, and my colleague Milan Vaishnav actually at Carnegie has done some incredible work, particularly polling the Indian American diaspora to sort of suss out, what their attitudes are. But I would say, broadly speaking, these are sort of the headlines, right? I think Indian Americans continue, particularly the older generations, continue to follow developments in India very, very closely. They inevitably become ambassadors for the bilateral relationship, whether they seek that role or not. And that ambassadorship, in a sense, arises partly because of their own economic success in the United States. They become role models of some sort or another. Second, there is a dominant support for Prime Minister Modi. I would say there is a disproportionate degree of support for Prime Minister Modi, particularly among Indian Americans of an older generation. Younger Indian Americans, second generation, third generation, they may have different attitudes. But those Indian Americans who still have active links with India, as is the case with many diasporas, right? They tend to be much more supportive of, the countries from which they immigrated from than their kids. And so what Modi has always done when he has come to India, come to the United States, is not just to focus on, interstate sort of engagement. So he's done the diplomatic stuff that he has to do, conversations with the White House and so on and so forth. But he's attempted to also reach out, to Indian Americans and non-resident Indians. And he's done it sometimes through, these, huge public events like Howdy Modi and so on and so forth. I expect he will do something similar when he comes this time in June, because I think he sees this again as part of a wider Indian diaspora that is very influential in its host country, and that could play a role in building the relationship that he wants with the United States. So there is both an emotional element as well as a calculated element of national strategy in his outreach.
Dr. Ashley Tellis, our time has come to an end. I really can't thank you enough. Virtue is not always its own reward, because we'll be bothering you again, I am sure, before we send our delegation off to India, which we're still, cogitating about, but it will inevitably happen. Please send my Jerry Green's best to your family and to you. And let's try and do this next time in person in Los Angeles. You are still Californian, so
I would very much love that, Jerry. Of course, thank you so very much, and of course, the best to you as well, and to Madeline.
Thank you, and I want to thank Val and Sam and our audience for joining us this